Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you back to our midweek Bible study, and we're in session 4 of a series we've been in called Cold Case Christianity. And through this study, what we've been doing is examining the claims of the Gospels. One of the key themes we've talked about throughout this entire study is that if, what's recorded in the Gospels about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, if that cannot be trusted, if it's not reliable, then, as the Apostle Paul said, your faith is useless. Our faith is useless. We are wasting our time. There's no need to devote our lives to Jesus, to spend our resources for His causes, to try to follow His ways and follow His teaching. There's no need to do any of that if what's recorded in the Gospels about Him simply can't be trusted. So one of the key questions that we've been asking through this study is there any way to tell if what's recorded in the Gospels about Jesus is reliable beyond a reasonable doubt? Is it possible that the disciples were lying about everything that is written in the Gospels? Is that possible? Yes, of course it's possible. But the question is it reasonable to think that? When we look at all the evidence surrounding it, is it reasonable to think they were lying about all these things? Well, the challenge in making a case like this is that we're dealing with an event that occurred a long time ago, and there are no longer any living eyewitnesses to talk to. There's little to no physical evidence that we have to examine. So how do we make this case? How do we put the claims of the Gospels to the test to see if they're reliable? Well, the only way we can do this is by examining the circumstantial evidence. And we've pointed out through this study that phrase, circumstantial evidence, for a lot of people has a negative connotation. They think that, circumstantial evidence can't be trusted. But it's been pointed out in this study that in a court of law today, a judge would tell any jury to consider circumstantial evidence as just as important, to hold the same amount of weight as direct evidence. What's direct evidence? Direct evidence would be an actual eyewitness who saw the event, who saw the crime, and they come and give their testimony in a court of law. Circumstantial evidence would be little pieces of evidence about the case that all point towards either the person being guilty or not, or either the event being true or not being true. That's what circumstantial evidence is. And so, is there enough circumstantial evidence about the gospel writers and the events that they claim to have happened to be reliable? Well, over the past 3 weeks, we have watched Jim Wallace. Jim is actually a former atheist. He was an atheist up until his mid-30s. He's also a former homicide detective who worked cold cases in Los Angeles for a large part of his career. And what kind of led Jim on his path of discovery was he kind of wanted to disprove Christianity, and he saw the claims of Christianity as being very similar to the cold cases that he worked. A cold case is an event that occurred in the past. There's no longer any living eyewitnesses. There's little to no physical evidence. So what you have to do is you have to try to make a case based on circumstantial evidence. Is there enough other pieces of evidence that surround all of it to either point to the guilt or innocence of the suspect? And so Jim said that claims of Christianity are a lot like that. And so he applied those same techniques to the claims of the gospel writers to see if they were reliable or not. And Jim, over the past sessions where we've been watching his videos, he's answered 4 key questions that any judge would ask a jury to consider when they're testing to see whether a witness's testimony is reliable or not. Can what the witness is saying, can it be trusted? And one of the ways they figure that out is by asking these 4 questions. Number 1, were they present? And Jim has shown us through the circumstantial evidence that's available that shows that the gospel accounts were written early enough so that the gospel writers could be eyewitnesses of those events that they claim to report. Or they could have at least talked to eyewitnesses who did see those things, that they're early enough for that to be true. Number 2, were they corroborated? In other words, are there any outside sources that can point towards the credibility of what's recorded, of the testimony. And what we saw again through the evidence that's available to us, that the events recorded in the Gospels can be corroborated by outside sources. Archaeology points to the truthfulness of what the Gospel writers were saying. Non-Christian historians of that time who wrote about the area of Judea and the events that were taking place in that time in history, they also confirm many of the key facts the Gospel writers are claiming to be true. And so, again, it can be corroborated from outside sources. Third question, were they accurate? And again, Jim showed us that the picture of who Jesus is has not changed over time. It wasn't like, when Jesus was alive, that he was just a normal person like you and me, but happened to be a wise teacher. And then over the years, people who followed Jesus or were his disciples, that they started to change who Jesus was, that they added in that he could perform miracles, or that he claimed to be the Son of God, or that he rose from the dead. No, Jim showed us from the evidence that's available, when we have these thousands of manuscript copies that were made of the original Gospels. And what those copies show that were made over the years, when you trace them back to the earliest copies we have, what we see is the picture of Jesus doesn't change. We can also look at the early Christian leaders in the church who wrote letters to one another. And in those letters, they quote the Gospels. They quote passages from the Gospels. And again, we can trace those letters back to very close to the events of the life of Jesus and on upwards through history. And what we see is the picture of Jesus doesn't change. From the very beginning, the earliest picture we have of Jesus is of someone who claimed to be the Son of God, who could perform miracles, and who rose from the dead. The last question we looked at was, were they biased? And yeah, Jim made it very clear. The people who wrote the Gospels, the disciples, obviously were close followers of Jesus. And so some people will say, well, you can't trust what they said about Jesus. They're too biased. They're too close to him. They love him too much. They want to make him look good to everybody, so you can't trust what they say about him. But Jim pointed out, just because they were close followers of Jesus, just because they were close to him and loved him, doesn't mean that you can't trust what they said about him. Even though it is amazing and it includes supernatural elements, doesn't mean that you can't trust anything that they're saying. And one of the key things Jim pointed out to show that this is true is that he said, sticking to their testimony about Jesus, and their testimony included, he is the Son of God, he performed miracles, he rose from the dead. Sticking to that testimony about Jesus only brought the disciples and those early followers, it only brought them persecution, poverty, imprisonment, and ultimately death. And Jim made the point that, no one would go through that kind of suffering for something they knew to be a lie. Yes, it is true, people die every day for things that they just don't believe that they're a lie, or don't know that they're a lie. But no one is going to go through the kind of suffering these early followers of Jesus went through for something they know to be a lie. The only reason a person would endure all that is if what they were saying about Jesus was true, that they had seen it with their own eyes. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to begin to examine the most outrageous claim the disciples and the writers of the Gospels ever made about Jesus, that he rose from the dead. And what Jim is going to do is he's going to begin to walk through all the possible explanations for why the disciples would have said this about Jesus, that he rose from the dead. And then, just as we've done before, Jim's going to look at all the circumstantial evidence surrounding that claim, and then go through that list and begin to mark off all the possible explanations that simply do not make sense based on the circumstantial evidence we have available to us. And in the end, we see which explanation makes the most sense based on the evidence. Even if it is hard to believe, even if it's, just a fantastic idea, you simply have to come to grips with which possible explanation makes the most sense based on the evidence. So Jim's going to begin to work through some of those things today. So let's watch this video together.
Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what's reasonable. We're going to move right to the resurrection, okay? Because I think Chris is right. We talked about the reasonable and the standard of proof being beyond a reasonable doubt, but how do we decide what is reasonable? And that's the thing we're going to address in this last session, and we'll look at the resurrection. Okay? You guys have been really good, really patient, so I appreciate your patience going through all this evidence together. I want to start off with a story about a woman in our city who was a bank robber and a perennial drug addict. We get called out to her house one day. We've been there 1,000 times for all kinds of drug-related calls, and she was dead in her bed. And when we got there, officers looked at this. This is her nightstand. And her nightstand is cluttered with all the paraphernalia she used to get high. She was a heroin addict who smoked rock cocaine. So she would cook her heroin in these cans, on the bottom of these cans, and inject the heroin with these needles. You can see the blood here from different injections she's done before. So there's a number of hypodermic needles here, 1, 2, there's a few of them. And whenever she smoked rock, you've got pipes, rock pipes here. She'd been a problem in our city for a number of years. And when officers got there, this is just an overdose waiting to happen, this lady. So they get there, and she's dead in the bed, and they called basically called the coroner, and they just stood around there waiting to see the coroner's going to get there. They never even bothered to pull down the blanket, because when they walked in to a known drug addict who appears to have overdosed, and that's what's on your nightstand, okay, she finally kicked out. She finally overdosed. But when they pulled the blanket down, she'd been stabbed to death. So they were absolutely wrong about their presuppositions. They had a view of who she was. They had an expectation when they walked in the room. And if you have an expectation when you walk in the room, trust me, you'll find a way to view all the evidence through the lens of your expectation. This is called presuppositional bias. And we have to be careful when we walk into crime scenes that we don't view everything through the lens of our biases, right? What we think the case might be. Now, I say that because we're about to do something. We have to remove our bias, because my whole sense of Scripture was, even if it's a reliable account about some aspects of history, look, I can find archaeological evidence to support 18th, 17th century England and all the locations that are mentioned in Peter Pan. It doesn't make Peter Pan a real character. Got it? So although I might be able to find some archaeological evidence to support the New Testament, it does not mean that the miracles are true. It could just be mythology set in a historical context. Really, I had to ask myself, what is stopping me from embracing anything miraculous in the text? Well, it was my presupposition as a philosophical naturalist. I just did not think anything supernatural could occur. So I want to look at this now through this lens and see if you now see what I see. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our crime scene again. Oh, this time I've stabbed Jimmy to death. Just to remind you of that process we used called abductive reasoning. Remember, 2 lists, evidence in the room, ways to explain it. And we said, okay, this is the best way to explain it. Now we're going to turn the corner and use this process of abductive reasoning at the empty tomb of Jesus. Because I think the same process we could use here. We just have to have some evidence in the room and some ways to explain it. And then we'll see which of these ways to explain it is most reasonable. Make sense? So let's take a look at how we might do this. And I think that absolutely Chris was right. Paul does talk about this as a very important, the singular most important piece of evidence in the Christian worldview is the resurrection. Paul says, if we aren't telling you the truth about this, we have been lying to you. And worse than that, you bought the lie. You have put your trust in another life, your trust in the resurrection of yourself. In a false story, you're to be pitied if that's the case, because none of this is true. The resurrection is the key piece of evidence. So we're going to look at it and treat it that way. There's a biblical scholar who's become a friend of mine. He's really a great guy. His name is Gary Habermas. And Gary's written a book along with Mike Licona called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. I like this book, and I'll tell you why. Because he reminds me of me. He's examining the case for the resurrection in the way that I did. Here's what he did. Gary went out and he polled and surveyed every biblical scholar who's ever written, 3,400, I think, biblical scholars who have written about Jesus. all the way from the most conservative Bible-believing scholars all the way down to the most liberal Bible-rejecting scholars, like a Bart Ehrman. And he made a short list of all the minimal facts about the resurrection that everyone agrees to, even if you don't believe in Jesus as God, you believe in these minimal facts about Jesus. The very bare minimum facts. And I can tell you as an atheist, he lists like 13. I rejected all of them except for 3 or 4. As an atheist, I might have given you these 3 or 4 bare minimum facts about Jesus and the resurrection. So I'm going to list those as the evidence in the room. Then we're going to see if we can try to explain this evidence in the room. So here are the facts that I would have given you. I think I would have said, okay, Jesus was a real person. I'm not a Jesus myther. There are a lot of Jesus mythers who are out there right now, and if you look at that stuff, it's ridiculous. I mean, that's just, no serious scholar denies. Even Bart Ehrman will fight against those who deny that Jesus ever lived. And he's not a Christian, but he believes, it's crazy to think he never even lived. So I would have given you that he lived and that he died on a cross and was buried, but so what? That does not mean he rose from the grave. I also would have given you that the tomb was empty. And here's why I say that, because if you want to go game over on this thing right away, get the body out, drag it around town, or get the original claimers to recant. That would be game over. And none of that didn't happen. So we have something we have to explain. And I probably wouldn't have said it quite this way. I would have said that the disciples said they saw a risen Christ. Whether they actually believed it or not, I don't know. But yeah, I agree, they did say something about Jesus, and what they said seemed to really change the kingdom, okay? It changed the Roman Empire. And they seemed to be on fire. I might have given you this 4th one, but for sure I would have said, okay, these 3 I'm in on. But this does not mean he really rose from the dead. None of this guarantees a resurrection. These are minimal facts that as an atheist I could accept. They mean nothing in terms of proving a case for the resurrection. Because I would have said there are ways to explain those minimal facts that are not the Christian explanation. In fact, I'll give you 7 explanations on the wall here, only one of which is the Christian explanation. The bottom one will be the Christian explanation, but I think any of these might also make the case. The only question is, which of these makes the most sense? Which makes the most sense of these minimal facts? Here's the E list for evidence. Here's the E list for explanations. I think we need to look at some of these. The first one, for example. Maybe Jesus didn't really even die, and the disciples were wrong about this. A lot of Muslims believe this to be the case. There are a lot of atheists that say, hey, you know what? Your own scripture seems to speak against your belief that Jesus died. Think about it. Not many people in the first century died as a result of crucifixion in the short period of time that Jesus allegedly died. It took a little longer to die on a cross than that. And you know that's true because your Bible confirms it. Jesus is crucified alongside 2 thieves, right? But when the Roman guards come along to see if everyone's dead that night, when they get to Jesus and the 2 thieves are still alive. So why do you think Jesus is dead? They're still alive. Maybe they're all still alive. He suffered, he passed out, he was resuscitated, not resurrected. So maybe they were just wrong about his death. Well, I want to show you some hidden science in the Bible. I don't think this is the case. I think we can kind of make a case for the true death of Jesus by looking at some hidden science. Okay, I'm going to give it to you from a cop perspective. Look at this piece of scripture. I think this has always been an interesting piece of scripture. Because Luke is going to write this. And this is kind of weird. When I first read this, didn't you also think of this and go, wow, this is kind of bizarre? Luke says that he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. And then now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood. Really? Okay, we got some collective experience as humans in this room. How many of you have ever seen that? I'm sweating so hard, I'm now bleeding. I mean, come on. As a matter of fact, the early church fathers who first read this, the first believers who read this were going like, what in the world? They couldn't figure it out. They'd never seen that themselves. As a matter of fact, the people who first wrote about this were confused by it. I'll give you an example of this. Folks, for example, saw this passage and they're thinking, man, oh man, is Luke speaking poetically in some way? Or maybe we should, if we talk about this, let's just leave that section out. Let's just be quiet about that. As a matter of fact, Justin Martyr, when Justin Martyr writes about this passage of Scripture, he skips over the blood part. He doesn't even want to address it. Why? Because no one can figure it out. If you're going to write a story about Jesus you want me to believe, why would you stick that in there? All it does is confuse it. And we know the first hearers were also confused because they tell you they're confused. But we know now what this is. This is actually a piece of hidden science that's in the Bible. Because this condition has now been documented, but it's very rare. What's it called? It's called this. Psychogenic hematidrosis. And where do we see it? If you go on the CDC, if you look at where you see this condition, Wikipedia, you're going to find that we see it most often in people who are sentenced on death row. The vast 70% of all studies of this condition are seen in death row inmates. So maybe Luke, he's a doctor, he's going, hey, dude, I'm going to write about hematidrosis. Because about 2,000 years from now, people are going to see that thing and go, this is legit. Because, man, they ain't going to get it for 2,000 years. But trust me, when they finally get it, they're going to go, wow. I don't think so. It could just be that it was seen, it was observed, and now it's recorded for us because it actually happened. There's another piece of hidden science, but I want to walk you toward the second piece in a few steps. Because Jesus had an unusual path to the cross. His personal narrative getting to the cross is different than others who were condemned to the cross. For example, he's being accused of claiming to be the Messiah. Not only that, of claiming as the Messiah to have some authority even over Caesar. Oh, don't say that. He's brought in front of the Jewish council. Here's what happens. He's being questioned. He says to them, kind of getting himself ready for a beating here, I think, why do you question me? He questioned those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. When he had said that, one of the officers smacked him in the head. You don't talk to the high priest that way. And the beating begins right here. His path to the cross is full of torment that others don't get because he made claims that others didn't make. What happens next? Well, it gets worse. They blindfold him. They start beating him with his fist. They slap him in the face. By the way, you'll see that every ancient, classic, Renaissance version of a painting about Jesus during this Passion Week, during this night of his trial, he's always in pristine condition. I don't care what kind of beating he takes, you won't see much blood on the classic Renaissance paintings. Jesus is given more respect than that. But I think it's deceptive for us because we have the tendency to underestimate what he endured because he's never painted that way. So it gets worse from this point. The next thing that happens, according to Scripture, is that they scourged him. Oh, that sounds like, they scourged him. They scourged him. Do you know what that entailed? It entailed taking a whip called a flagrum that had pieces of rock or bone at the end, like a cat of nine tails, and beating this guy to within an inch of his life because those parts were bad enough. This part's bad enough. This part's killer. They opened him up. But even when you go back for a second, look at the painting. Still looks pretty good, huh? You never see Jesus the way he really looked because he suffered from that flagrum. It would not have been pretty. It doesn't stop there. They get him back down in front of the, it seems that Pilate doesn't even want to do this. He's kind of like saying to the people who want him executed, dude, I don't see anything wrong with this guy, okay? How about this? I don't think we can execute him. How about if I beat him to within an inch of his life? Go ahead and beat him. They beat him up, bring him back in front. Good enough? We done now? Are we done now? Okay, look at him now. He's a mess. Are we done? No. Execute him. Execute him. That's not enough. They want more. He's enduring a lot more than most endured getting to the cross. Now, basically, he's got a crown of thorns stuck on his head. They give him a reed like a staff. They start beating him with the reed. Then, by the time he actually gets to the point where by the way, let's go back for a second. How's he look? Pretty good. By the time he's actually carrying his cross, unlike others, the Son of God cannot carry his cross. What's that about? He's already starting to show the signs, the hidden science. We know what happens when people take a beating like this. They start to go into some form of shock, circulatory shock. He can't even carry his own cross. Then they actually execute him. And even in the most traditional versions of this, it doesn't look that bad. Now, I suspect that most of us are now familiar with what? The Passion of the Christ. Have you seen that movie? Was that a bit disturbing? Because finally you got past the Renaissance paintings and you got to see what Jesus probably looked like. And it's not pretty. But it's important for us to understand this, so now when we get to the second piece of hidden science, you'll recognize it. And it's here in the Gospel of John, who's a fisherman, not a doctor. He says, the soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus. Why? Because it's getting close to sundown. We've got to get these bodies off the cross. You've got to be dead before I can take you off the cross. If you're on the cross and you're not dead, the way to get you dead is to break your legs so you can't push up anymore and take a breath. You'll suffocate on the cross with your legs broken. So the idea here is to go through and break the legs of all the people on the cross so to make sure they're dead. But when they get to Jesus, it says they didn't break his legs. They came and found that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Really? If I'm writing this thing, this is a fictional account, I think I might imagine to put the blood in. But would you have put water in that also? Remember I told you how the sweating blood was confusing to the earliest believers? Oh, this is much worse. Everyone who writes about this cannot figure out what the water's from. And there's lots of early church fathers who write about this passage. And they try to figure out a way to contextualize it, to analogize it, to make it a metaphor, to figure out what that water means. Is it about baptism? Is it about the Holy Spirit? And if it's Tertullian or Origen or Jerome, anyone who writes on this passage, because certainly it couldn't be real water came out of his body. It makes no sense. Why would water come out of his body? Hidden science. If you've ever been to a car accident where somebody has suffered blunt force trauma before they die, or a beating, blunt force trauma before they die, they are going to go into circulatory shock. At the point of heart failure, you have something called effusion that occurs. Two forms of effusion. One is circulatory shock caused either pericardial effusion, which is where water collects in the sac around your heart. But most doctors who have studied this will tell you that this sac is very close to the heart. So if you were to poke it with a blade and come back out again, the water and blood would be so close to each other that you wouldn't even see a separation at all. But if you suffer from pleural effusion in your lungs, that would be different. Because now water is going to collect in the lung. And if you're in a hanging position, it's going to collect in like a lower sac. If you stab that part of the chest cavity and pull out the blade, you're going to see a separation of water and blood. This would explain what he's seeing. Unless he's thinking like Luke, if I write this water thing into this, no one's going to get it for a few hundred years, but 2,000 years from now when they discover what pleural effusion is, they're going to think, this is Jake. This is legitimate. Okay. Or he's just describing what he saw. Nobody gets it because nobody understands pleural effusion until we get it. Now we got a piece of hidden science in the scripture. That makes sense to me. Also, I want you to read this passage from the Gospels. Look how fast I read this, okay? They take down his body from the cross. By the way, do you realize that in our culture, if your Aunt Mildred dies tomorrow in her bedroom, you're going to go over to her house, and I doubt you're going to pick up her body and carry it to the mortuary. You're just going to call the mortuary, and they're going to come and get your Aunt Mildred. And if she dies suspiciously, you get there, you're not quite sure why she died. She's only 50 years old. She's not suffering from any suspicious death. Well, then you're going to call the coroner. The coroner's going to come and handle your Aunt Mildred. In either case, few of us have ever had prolonged contact with dead bodies. When's the last time you moved a dead body around? When's the last time you really looked at a dead body other than in a box? We don't have that experience in the 21st century because we have services in place that handle that for us. But that wasn't the case in the first century. You buried your own. So everyone had contact with the dead, and they were very familiar with what the dead looked like. Now look at this passage. As evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. 4 things. Do you think it happened as fast as I just said it? I can say it in 4 seconds, but it didn't happen in 4 seconds. That took time to get the cross off, to get the nails out of his hands and feet, to get him wrapped. And there are 3 inconvenient truths about dead bodies that, trust me, if you pull one off a cross, you're going to see one of these 3. I'll introduce them to you by way of the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. There it is. Nice old building. But in the basement where we do autopsies, it's a kind of a house of horrors. If you're involved in a murder, if you get killed, I'm going to have to go, if I'm working the case, I'm going to have to go to the autopsy. Why? Because coroners never want to testify in preliminary hearings. So I have to testify for the coroner in the preliminary hearing. So I have to go and watch the autopsy so I can testify for the coroner. Make sense? So I go to all the autopsies of these dead people. There's no fun. This is an interesting building, though. It's an old, kind of 1930s building that's structured there. And right here, when you walk in the door and you go right over here, that's the gift shop. Yeah, go online. Google it online. Los Angeles County Coroner's gift shop. You can get all kinds of cool stuff. You can get aprons that have a body outline that says "Stay cool," because they do. It's all like refrigerated bodies. You can get cutting boards. We'll give you a hand. It says on there. No, I'm serious. They actually have this stuff at the coroner's office. It's pretty funny. I should bring a T-shirt when I do these talks. Anyway, but in the actual examination room, this is how they might look today. But back when I was doing this work a lot, they didn't have these nice, clean metal surfaces. There's a reason why these examination rooms have metal like this and why there's a grate right here. That grate is so you can hose down all the stuff that's on that table and get it into that grate. I just talked to somebody who was there last year. They still use wooden tables in Los Angeles. Think about that for a second. Right, you're cutting up bodies on wooden tables. This room is horrific. It smells so bad. It's like a big bloody house of horrors. It's a factory of dead bodies that die in Los Angeles County. And if you've been dead for 6 days and you're all bloated and stinky, you still get an autopsy. I used to go in there sometimes if the guy next to me was a big, swollen up, bloated guy. I was like, oh, please, can we hurry this up? Because I don't want him to cut into that guy before we get done. Because that's not going to be any fun. And I can tell you, this is a nasty mess. There's actually a sign on the back wall here that says, no eating in the examination room. I'm not kidding. Like we're going to eat in the examination room. But there are three inconvenient truths that happen at death. It's called the mortis triad. And I can't imagine you could ever try to get Jesus' body off that cross without noticing these things. The first thing you see is that people, when they die and their heart stops pumping, and that heart is pumping warm blood, the first thing they do is they cool down. And they get cold to the touch. If you think that dead bodies look like unconscious bodies in the movies, when they're dead, there's something different about a dead body. It's not like a sleeping body. It's very different. As soon as you walk in, you know that guy's not sleeping. That guy's dead. And so you see this, the cooling is the first thing, though, to the touch, because now you don't have that hot gyroscope pumping blood through your body. Because that heart is not pumping blood, that's called algor mortis, by the way. You also have the body start to get stiff. That's called rigor mortis. So it's part of this mortis triad. They get stiff. You hang on that cross, if I don't get you down, you're going to come off the cross and your arms are going to come down very slowly because you're in that stiff position. That's where you started. You got to push those arms down. The last thing you do is you have bruising, because the blood is not continuing to pump through your body. So gravity is going to pull the unmoving blood, uncirculating blood. It's going to pull it to the lowest extremity. If you die on your back and I get there and I roll you over, your back's going to be black and purple. Your front will be pretty white because all the blood is now, gravity's taking it to the lowest point. And that is called liver mortis, mortis triad. The reason why we don't think about this is because we don't have daily contact with dead bodies as part of our culture. But the first century did. To say that you think they could get this body and they were fooled, he was just passed out. Really? Okay, it's possible. It's just not reasonable. By the way, that's the whole determining factor here. Separating what's possible from what's reasonable. Anything's possible. So isn't it possible he didn't die? Absolutely. It's just not reasonable. And I don't care what's possible. I only care about what's reasonable. Well, maybe it's a different issue. Maybe they're just lying about this. They're conspiring. Well, that comes down to why they would lie. We've already talked about that. But this is often argued as this whole thing is an elaborate lie. Okay, let's talk about that for a second. That means we're talking about conspiracy theory. I can help you with conspiracy theory because I have to work these all the time. Anytime two or more people commit a murder, they're involved in a conspiracy. It's an additional charge in California. Probably an additional charge here in Indiana. You add that additional charge. Now, I can tell you that conspiracies require 5 things to work. I know because I work these. If you have these 5 things, you can actually pull off a conspiracy. Without these 5 things, it's very difficult. And for those of you who are in this room right now who love conspiracy theories, stop it. Okay, it's stupid. If you want to be seen as a rational, thinking person, and you think that some large segment of the U.S. government is involved in a 50-year-old conspiracy, please. These 5 things are necessary for a conspiracy. The first thing you need is the lowest possible number of conspirators. It's much easier for 2 people to lie than it is for 25 people to lie and hold the lie. You also need the shortest possible time span in which to hold the conspiracy. It's easier to hold a conspiracy for 10 minutes than it is for 10 years. Right? Does that make sense? You need excellent communication between co-conspirators. You need to make sure that I know if I stop this guy and he gets asked, does he have our story together? What'd you tell him? I need to repeat to my guy what you told your guy to hold the conspiracy. You can't pre-plan everything in advance. You just can't. If I'm going to interview people, I always get into the weeds, the minutia of their story, because I know they planned this much, but I want to know what's going on down here because I know they didn't pre-plan this. This is where they're going to have problems matching their story. Make sense? The next thing you need, if you can get it, is if you've got a strong family relationship between co-conspirators, it's hard to break those because, a mom is not even going to waive her rights to speak to you about her son. That's your baby. By the way, the son will rat off the mom, but the mom won't rat off the son. And the last thing you really need, if you think about it, and this makes sense, don't you think, is you need some pressure. If you don't apply pressure to people who have done a conspiracy, why would they give it up? I mean, you got to apply some kind of pressure. Let me show you how this works in a real case. I got called out maybe 3 or 4 years ago, two years ago maybe, a case where 2 guys were involved in a murder. When I got there at the scene, I don't handle fresh murders. I'm a cold case guy. But when they call me out because I'm the oldest guy on the team. So I get out there and I'm looking at this thing just as an advisor, basically. And the guy who's assigned the case says, dude, look at this mess. And I said, yeah, we're looking for 2 guys at least. One guy couldn't do this. Do you have an idea who the first guy is? And he said, I think so. Do you want me to go out and arrest him? I said, no. You think he's going to just tell you who he did it with? We have a surveillance team. I worked on that team. Let's put our surveillance team on that guy. If you think you know who he is, we'll watch him for a few days. But here are my rules. When you watch him, stay with him the whole time. See who he's hanging out with. That may be your co-conspirator. But do not, when we take him to jail 4 days from now, do not let him know he was being watched by our surveillance team. Bring a black and white with you. If you've got some other reason to take him to jail, give him some pretense, take him to jail. Let the black and white come in and take him to jail. Do not let him see your surveillance cars. If you think you're going to take a burn, get out. Take him to jail right away with the black and white. Don't let him see you were following him. Cool, we can do that. They go out that night, they find him. He's driving around in the victim's car with one other guy. Probably the right guy, I think. This is good so far. We're in the victim's car. We got a co-conspirator. We're good to go. They follow him for 4 days. They buy dope. They go out. They spend some money. They actually sell the car to a bunch of gangsters in the valley. And so they made us split the team. One team stays with the car. One team stays with these 2 bad guys. And it's a big hassle. But at the end of it all, we finally take him to jail. 4 or 5 days later, we get him into custody. Now I know. Here's how you have a successful conspiracy. And they've got some things in their advantage. They've only got 2 people involved. That's as small a conspiracy as you can get. They've only had to hold it for 4 or 5 days. That's not bad. They aren't related to each other, so this is in my favor. They're just 2 friends. So I know I can't control these 2 things. That's done. But I can control these 3 things. This is not necessary. I got to control communication and pressure. So I separate these 2 guys. I take my time getting there. I wait a couple of hours. I go into the first room with the first guy, and I say, dude, I've been talking to your buddy for the last 2 hours. I hadn't been, but I told him I was. And this guy does not want to go to jail for what he says you did. He's willing to lay you out. And he told me everything you did for the last 4 days. Let me tell you what you did for the last 4 days. And I tell him everything they did for the last 4 days as if his partner told me, when in fact I actually watched it with our surveillance team. He couldn't believe his partner would rat him out that quickly. He was upset. And he gave me about 10%, 20% more. So what do you think I'm going to do next? Go to the other guy. Dude, I've been with your partner for the last 4 hours. He does not want to go to jail for what he says you did. And he's told me he's willing to work with me. He's given me all the information about you, and I give him everything we watched him do plus the 20%. How many times do you think I need to go back and forth? 3 times. Both of them copped out completely. They're both serving life in jail, no parole. They were 19 when they did this. Very young. But I knew I had to control some things. I had to control the communication. They can't talk to each other to see what, they had no idea what I was doing, and they couldn't talk to each other. And I had to put pressure on them. So they thought that they were going to be the only one to go. Make sense? So once you know the 5 things that are required for a conspiracy, now you know how to break conspiracies. And this is what we do when we work conspiracy theories. Make sense? Okay, now I want you to turn a corner. Instead of these 5 guys or these 4 guys I have on the wall, I want you to imagine now the conspiracy that the 12 would have to pull off in order to get the Christian conspiracy to work, given the 5 things that are required. Let's play a game of Clue. Put the clue board up. And instead of having your usual clue board, we'll go ahead and use the area around where Jesus had his ministry. There it is. Put the game pieces on, they'll be the disciples. Put a couple cards down. The first thing we got to ask ourselves is, okay, how long do these guys have to hold this conspiracy? How about 60 years? Really? Really? Okay, stop. All you JFK conspirators, all that stuff, just stop. I mean, do you think it wouldn't be a payday for somebody by now to tell the truth about some of these things? A cultural payday, a book deal, a movie, protection, all the stuff you want. You'd be a cultural hero. No, that's not good. How about this one? Do they have a way to communicate with each other? Well, they're not in this holy huddle. They're all over the map. So do you really think that Thomas knows in India what Matthew is talking about in North Africa? You don't think this guy who's interrogating Thomas and beating the dog snot out of him is going to say to him, dude, your partners already gave this up. Tell me the truth. Why would you want to die alone for this lie? Everyone's getting that routine done to them. They're getting beat to death. As a matter of fact, the kind of pressure that's being applied, let's take a look at that. That's a whole other thing. I love Clue. Don't you love Clue? They're getting Jack Bauer pressure, okay? And then they're just getting beat to death. Terrible pressure, no communication, separated by thousands of miles for 60 years. Okay, yeah, I mean, it's possible. I don't think it's a reasonable I really don't think this is a reasonable. Now, there were some brother relationships, but how is Matthew related to any of these guys? He's not. Why does he care what's happening to this guy? Forget it. Who in their right mind is willing to die for nothing they know is a lie when their partners are being told they're going to get off for it? Okay, it's possible because anything's possible, but I just think it's ridiculous. It's not reasonable. That's not a reasonable scenario. And of course, we already talked about motive, right? How motive is by those 3 things we talked about. And these folks never gave up their testimony. They didn't get rich off of it. They didn't get a lot of girlfriends off of it. And they didn't get really, they couldn't even control the way they died. I think it's, now also, if you're going to tell this story and you're going to lie about it, do you really think you're going to make the first observers of the risen Jesus women? It's Mary who sees Jesus first. You think you're going to believe a woman in the first century on this if you're making fiction out of this, the first person who should see Jesus should be either Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus. 2 people who had juice in the culture who people might actually believe. Instead, you're going to say that women saw it? That's just not a good way to go. Now, by the way, women could testify in trials. This idea that women had they would testify in hearings, but honestly, they were not considered as reliable as men. But that's who actually saw him. So you just write it out the way it actually occurred. I think this idea that they're lying is certainly possible. It's just not reasonable. You're going to get tired of hearing that.
Okay, so next Wednesday, on our video for next Wednesday, Jim's going to finish out working his way through that list of possible explanations. And then in the end, just decide which explanation makes the most sense based on the evidence. And then challenge all of us. What are we going to do with that? How is that going to change your life? How is it going to change the way you think and you live and you see this world and you think about this world? So for your homework assignment this week, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read chapter 7 in the book Cold Case Christianity. I know most of you have probably gotten a copy of this book by now. And I want you to read chapter 7 to kind of reinforce some of the things that Jim talked about on the video today. And then we will see you next week. Have a great week, everybody.